Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Yes indeed, time for another rock and read. Today we'll pick up where we left off with part 2 of chapter 13 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Part 2 is called The Long Run. Did Don run a marathon? Let's find out. In the summer of 1979, we were back to the grindstone in Miami. Don's vocals on The Long Run made us think we might finally be able to finish the album and have our title track, but the days of Don and Glenn sitting down and happily writing songs together, and of us actually believing we could deliver a double album, had ended. Of 10 songs, 7 were collaborations with people like J.D. Souther or Bob Seger. One was Joe Walsh's solo work in the city. My contribution was 2 songs, The Disco Strangler and Those Shoes. Although there were at least 3 other tracks I had brought to the album that Don had started to do something with, but was never able to finish. I remember sitting in the studio and playing one track that I had written and was especially proud of called You're Really High, Aren't You? We'd started to record it and Don sat there and suddenly said, I see it, I know what I gotta do with that track. Everybody thought, oh great, we got another one. But sadly, he never followed through, and the track was consigned to the cutting room floor. It was very disheartening, and the frustration was immense. I put that track carefully to one side in the hope that maybe for the next album Don's inspiration would return. For Those Shoes, which was accepted, I wrote most of the music, drum parts, bass, and guitar parts, except the solo, which was Joe's. I wrote it as a demo and gave it to Don and Glenn, and we added Talks box guitars and beefed it up a little bit. The concept behind the song was, I believe, how high heels turn a man on. Don took my basic track and ran with it. At the end, he sang, Merci, Monsieur Jordan, a tribute to the shoe designer Charles Jordan. Disco Strangler was designed as an antidote to the Bee Gees disco craze that was going on at the time, after the success of the 1977 film Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta. The one thing the Eagles agreed on was that we all hated disco music. It seemed so unmusical and repetitive to us ballad boys. There was no melody to it, just 4 on the floor, straight quarter note, bass drum beats, so I took that as a basis and played with it. Dawn sang the lyrics after coming up with the concept of a woman dancing in the spotlight, urging people to look at her and how beautiful she is. The Disco Strangler has been waiting in the wings all along. The fiddler in Your Darkest Night is ready to slide his hands around her pretty throat. I had a good time recording that one cut. One of the pieces I'm second most proud of after Hotel California also came out of the Long Run album. It is a short guitar solo in Sad Cafe, a song Don wrote, loosely based on days at the Troubadour Club. I wrote a multi-track acoustic solo for it, inspired by the song Midnight at the Oasis by Maria Muldaur, which had been a huge hit. It's only about 8 bars long, but I was very happy with the way I was able to take that section and create a 6-track harmony that worked. I can still listen to that and smile to myself. Glenn had only brought one song to the album so far, a number called Teenage Jail, which was by far his worst writing effort and had a crazy balls-to-the-wall guitar solo at the end of it. My solo was the result of a 4 in the morning, whacked-out, coked-out session, and to this day I'm embarrassed to have played it. It just keeps lingering like a bad smell. Glenn fled back to L.A. and called up his old friend Bob Seger to ask if he had anything. Fortunately, he had, and between them, they came up with Heartache Tonight. We raced back to Miami to record it for Glenn to sing, and he was as happy as he could be, knowing that he finally had something. In it, he made the prophecy that someone was going to hurt somebody before the night was through. When it came to recording solo guitar parts in the studio, there was considerable competition. Glenn would take first shot, then me, then Joe, and whichever guy came up with the coolest part won. We each had totally different styles, but somehow they worked together as well as separately. It was a real challenge in terms of personalities because Joe and I had hit it off personally and musically, and we really wanted to write stuff for a 2 or 3 guitar band. Between the two of us, there was a lot of camaraderie, which really produced some original and unique sounds. When we were cutting Those Shoes, we recorded live onto those basic tracks and found a place for a guitar solo. The first couple of times nobody played, and then the last time Joe played, and it was great, so it stayed on the record that way. There was a lot of trying out new material and ways of playing it for the good of the project. On the long run, I played keyboards for the first time on record. I just started playing in the studio, and it worked. Joe used to play keyboards on some songs too. Everybody did whatever was necessary to make the best record without trying to insist on playing solo or stepping up to the mic. That was the musical dynamite when it was at its best. When it was at its worst, drugs were usually to blame. Cocaine and alcohol with quaaludes thrown in was bad medicine, even if it did smooth off the edges. It's amazing we're all still alive. I can't count the number of nights I drove home from the studio with the sun coming up. I'd cruise down Ocean Boulevard, my nose still tingling, heading for a house I shared with Joe in Key Biscayne. I could hardly keep the car on the road for grinding my teeth. I'd have been up all night. I'd reach home by 6, fall into bed, then wake up and have to get back to the studio and start all over. In the end, I became fed up with driving home, worried that I was going to crash. And I was always afraid a Miami cop would stop me and throw me in jail after finding drugs in my pocket. Even on so-called days off, I'd leave the studio at 5 in the morning, high as a kite, and keep going. Joe and I might play golf at 1 in the afternoon with a couple beers, then continue partying. Sure enough, our day off became another marathon. Instead of recovering, we'd rush right back in. I didn't want to be locked into that life anymore, so I booked myself a little suite in the Coconut Grove Hotel, a few blocks away from the studio. Now when I left, I just had to stagger a few blocks. I'd push a button, enter the elevator, fumble with my room key, and crash out. I'd wake up and order room service instead of going downstairs to fumble with pots and pans. Since they had a gym, I could also work out and maintain some semblance of normality. I didn't mean to withdraw from the others. I was just tired of that long drive. The studio marathon went on. We were down to our bare nerve endings in terms of stress. I think the whole band had been suffering from postpartum depression after Hotel, and now we were heavily pregnant again with the next baby, and the strain was showing. To allow us to spend more time with our families and less in Florida, some of the recording was moved to the One Step Up studio in West Hollywood. It would be fair to say, I think, that this became our least favorite studio album, because it represented such a dark time personally. We were struggling to write. We were struggling with drug and alcohol abuse, and we were struggling with interpersonal relations and egos. The whole album had this dark cloud of dissension around it. It finally divided us into two camps, Don and Glenn versus me and Joe, the guitar players. Timothy was somewhere floating around, the wanderer as ever. Finally, we exhausted ourselves, exhausted our patience, and took so many drugs that nobody could see any further solutions except to finish what we had and walk away from it. The album became known as the long one at the record company. It wasn't helped by the way we worked, which was actually quite a strange and lengthy process. We'd start with a basic track, intro, verse, second verse, chorus, third verse, chorus, bridge, and out, and set some device to help us keep our tempo together. We'd fill up 10 or 12 reels over 2 or 3 days, each reel having 3 to 5 takes on it, recording that same track over and over, constantly arranging and creating it. Then there'd be an editing session where we'd put up 24 track tapes and listen to each reel to find out what the best feel was for the drums. From tape 12, we might take the first 8 bars, from tape 3, the second 8 bars, and from tape 5, the first bar and a half of the second bridge. Bill would listen with those fantastic ears of his and say, "Oh, good first verse," or "Nice bridge" from one tape, and then shake his head and say, "Well, that's about it." Then on the next tape he'd listen and say, "Oh, good, great intro. That was a really good intro." Or, "The drum fill was really great going into the chorus," and so on, until the floor of the control room was literally carpeted with 2-inch tapes standing on edge. All those little pieces would start coming out of these basic tracks and be edited together until that drum track sounded really good, even if everything else sounded awful, because we could fix all the other stuff later. When our master tape went by on a 24-track tape machine, it looked like a zebra. There were so many edits. Each one of us would then have to repair our guitar, keyboard, and bass parts. We did so much of this that Bill had to lay these tapes on an edit block and re-splice them with a razor blade because they'd start to fall apart from going around and back and forth so many times. And he didn't want to monopolize 2 machines, so we had to work on that master only. Finally, when all the recording was done and ready to mix, Bill, whose new nickname became Coach because of his role in the studio and his passion for sports, would sit in the control room and not allow anyone else in for a couple hours until he got a mix that he wanted everyone to hear. Then we'd all go in, each carrying a legal pad, and make notes as the track went by, suggesting various adjustments. Echo too loud, drum fill too soft, and so on, and Bill would try to make those corrections by hand on his console, feeling what he was mixing. Finally, we'd get to the point where we liked to mix 5 or 7, and we'd all go away and shoot pool or have dinner, while Coach got up the next mix. If we finished one mix every day and a half, we were doing really well. We'd take a batch home with us and listen to them again for a few days, in the car or on the stereo, to see if our choice still held up. Bill was great at holding the reins while letting the horses run at their own pace. He never pushed us or forced us to make creative decisions. He'd sit there and let us listen with his eyes closed. If his head was bouncing, you knew we had a great take. But if he stopped and stared at one of the speakers, you knew he heard something he didn't like. He really had a marvelous set of ears, listening for a coherent performance in which we all meshed perfectly as a band. "Well, Bill," we'd say at the end, our faces hopeful, "do we have all the pieces yet?" "I'd like to hear a couple more good bridges," he'd say, and we'd do as he asked, concentrating really hard on playing that particular part well. Trouble is, you can't go back and record another bridge 3 or 4 days later. It won't splice in. The sound is different, the humidity is different that day, people play their instruments a little differently, and so you have to keep going, keep recording until you have all the pieces, which is where cocaine comes in. If you listen to Eagles records, there's nothing out of tune, there are no foibles. They're almost inhumanly flawless, and in my opinion, sometimes to a fault. Because of Don's perfectionism and Bill's professionalism, the two of them kept raising the bar for us to leap over. Unfortunately, in the end, we took that bar and hit each other over the head with it. And I think that many of our gutsiest, most spontaneous performances ended up needlessly on the control room floor. We tried so hard to be better and better, but in doing so, I think we lost something of the passion. Was this how B.B. King worked? On September 24, 1979, The Long Run was released. It had taken 18 months, almost a year longer than Hotel California, and it nearly killed us. The notes on the back of the album sleeve described it ominously as our last studio album. It debuted at number 1, but critics savaged it as a considerable disappointment. Rolling Stone was ambivalent. The reviewer described it as a bitter, writhing, difficult record full of piss and vinegar and poisoned expectations, but added, because it is steeped in fresh, risky material and unflinching self-examination, it's also the Eagles' best work in many, many years. The magazine ran the review with a critical cover story by a reporter who had spent 2 years hanging out with us and who claimed Don had likened himself to God. Don fired off a series of angry letters. Many read them, and since we had reached the end game, we reluctantly agreed to do some interviews to publicize the new album, but Don, Glenn, and Irving continued to control all the information released to the press. Only Don and Glenn were allowed to answer direct questions, and they had a series of pat answers ready if anyone asked about strife within the band. "How's everyone getting along?" someone would ask. "Oh, we loathe each other, as you can see," Glenn would reply, smiling. "That's why we just agreed to work together for the last 18 months to bring out this new album. Can't stand each other's guts," Don would add, winking. Steering the conversation away from controversial issues to the new project, they became masters at handling the media. Their quotes in a number of magazine profiles were eerily similar, as if they had precisely rehearsed the answers. Joe Walsh was allowed to give some interviews, and I did a few with Guitar Magazine, but we were all discouraged from speaking with the press. The policy thereafter became minimal contact. Fewer interviews, they hoped, would maintain a mystique and spin certain awkward situations. Instead of resting as we should have done, we played Japan, Hawaii, the East Coast, and the southern states, before embarking on another world tour. Every waking moment seemed to be spent eating, sleeping, and dreaming the Eagles. I took Jesse with me to Japan, hiring local nannies to care for him, just so I could spend some time with my son. He was 6 years old, and I felt we barely knew each other. Taking him into the toy shops in Tokyo after a ride on the bullet train was a dream come true for any father. His little face lit up under his white blonde hair, and I told him to pick out something he wanted. He was so overwhelmed he couldn't decide what to pick at first, but he finally settled on truckloads of Legos. I took him to a sumo wrestling match, courtesy of our very gracious promoter, Mr. Udo, and he met one of the great champions after the match, who coincidentally was called Super Jesse Sumo Man. Little Jesse watched this man mountain slamming into a telegraph pole in training backstage and felt the ground shake beneath his feet. He became a lifelong fan. He almost lost his balance, staring up at the huge piles of flesh towering over him. I don't think he ever forgot that. In Japan, I bought Susan a beautiful silk kimono, hand-embroidered in heavy material. Don Henley bought 20 for his collection. During the remainder of the tour, the road crew complained bitterly about having to lug them around. They were already transporting his personal mattress and sheets of plywood to ease his bad back in various hotel rooms he had to sleep in, and the kimonos represented one packing case too many. Heartache Tonight, the first single from the new album, written by Don, Glenn, JD, and Bob Seger, topped the charts and sold over 500,000 copies. The Long Run, the second single, rose to number 8. Our next single, I Can't Tell You Why, started by Timothy, reached the same level. Interest in us was still at an all-time high. Speaking of all-time highs, the cocaine abuse went crazy. Everybody in the music business was involved, even upper echelon executives. One of the presidents of a very large label probably had the biggest cocaine habit I knew of. Coke even had many of the lawyers, doctors, and managers strung out. It was the same with musicians and DJs. It had infested the entire industry. Nobody yet realized the long-term damage that would result from it. We just thought it was great, like pot. We'd have a great time and there wouldn't be a problem. It was the fun party drug of the 70s, and until you lost your house, your car, your family, and your kids and wound up in the hospital or rehab, you didn't realize how dangerous it could be. The movie Blow with Johnny Depp offers a perfect synopsis of what happened back then. The constant pace cocaine set didn't do much for our relationships. Being high allows for a false sense of camaraderie, but as soon as the drug wears off, you realize how fake it all is. Sometimes, just sometimes, everybody got along great. We'd drink together, get high, write songs, and jam. It was so fantastic when something good happened. We all look at each other in amazement and wonder if it could possibly last. There were some real highlights in the show we did around this time, the memory of which I shall feed on forever. Among them were the nights Roy Orbison opened for us for a series of concerts at the Los Angeles Forum, our first show in our adoptive hometown since 1976. Orbison was amazing. We'd be sitting in our dressing room and know exactly where he was in his set when we heard the audience explode because he had hit the high note in crying. You could set your alarm clock by him. Every night, like clockwork, we knew that after that high note, there'd be 2 more songs and then we'd be on. The audience responded really well to him. Some of these kids didn't even know who he was, and yet he got them going every night. He was a shy, quiet man, unbelievably humble. He just stood there dressed in black with his sunglasses on, singing his tail off. I was honored to be on the same stage as him. If there had been any justice in this world, we would have been opening for him. Another great memory of the LA Forum gigs was working with the Blues Brothers, John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, and Elton John when they came on and jammed with us during one of our encores. Man, that was really something. I think it was one of the best performances we ever gave. It felt incredibly emotional playing with these guys backed by a huge orchestra, hearing our music fill the whole place and all in our hometown. Elton John was like the Liberace of rock and roll, with his huge glasses and flamboyant outfits. On the radio, he came across as a completely different person from the man who appeared on stage. He was completely over the top, but always very friendly and charming, the quintessential polite Englishman. I liked him a lot. Don was by then dabbling in gambling, and he and Glenn and Irving took Elton to a casino one night in London after a gig, but didn't come away with as much as he'd liked to have won. The following day, the guys brought the blackjack table he had been playing on and had it sent over to his house with a tongue-in-cheek note which said, "For the amount you lost last night, you should at least own the table." During one gig with Elton and his band, I wandered into the men's room and found one of his musicians rolling around on the floor, screaming in pain and holding his nose. "What's the matter, man?" I asked, rushing to him. Blood was pouring from his nostrils. "I don't know," he wailed. "Someone just came in and offered me some blow, and I took some, and it stings like crazy. I think it must have been cut with something." We called the paramedics, and they flushed his sinuses with water before rushing him to a hospital. Someone had cut the coke with rat poison and nearly killed him. That event was a big warning to me, never to take any drugs offered by a stranger. You never know what nutcase was going to wander up to you and say, "Hey man, I love your stuff. Here, have some of this." And maybe have it laced with cyanide or something just to get their name on the network news. John Belushi became a friend of the band. We reciprocated the Blues Brothers' guest appearance with us in L.A. by playing at their Blue Bar after a gig at the Chicago Stadium. John had a party house in inner-city Chicago with a pool table, a bar, and a bandstand set up with guitar, drums, and a mic, and we'd just go along and jam with him all night, taking drugs and hanging out. He was everybody's favorite bad boy and such an upbeat, excitable guy who loved music and would pour himself into it like Joe Cocker. He was one of the funniest people I ever met, full of energy and brilliance. I still mourn his untimely death. Of all the wastes of life due to drug abuse in the music business, I think that was the one that hit me hardest. I couldn't get over the fact that all that vital, vibrant energy had been snuffed out in one single stupid moment. It gave me serious pause for thought. Another great moment of that tour was playing Wembley Stadium in England. It was a huge Art Deco place with something like 70,000 people all standing on the field, and in the stadium with us down at one end. The acoustics were such that the sound carried away from us like in a baseball stadium, when you see the ball fly up and hear the crack of it against the bat. Later that seems possible. We could see these people jumping to our music in tears around the stadium, but all in sequence like the Mexican wave as the music reached them. I had never seen that happen before. It was awesome. We had a lot of laughs during that show. The place and the people just made us high. We didn't need anything else. On nights like those, I realized that we kept going and remained together because we all knew that this was the best any of us could do musically, financially, and artistically. There was no other places to go. The sad part was that we were so completely burned out, physically and creatively, that the moments of pure joy were rare. The machine kept wanting more, and we simply couldn't deliver. The strain was becoming too much, and the drugs were making us increasingly paranoid. We were a train wreck waiting to happen. The new decade began with us at the top of the charts. The Long Run was certified platinum and topped the charts for 13 straight weeks, making it 1979's biggest-selling record. It sold 5 million copies and helped put Greatest Hits and Hotel California back into the top 100. The music we'd provided for the film Urban Cowboy that year also kept us in the public eye. The movie, starring John Travolta and Deborah Winger, was conceived and produced by Irving, and the soundtrack featured us, Jimmy Buffett, and Dan Fogelberg. By January 1980, though, non-stop touring was getting us all down. After each show, we'd head off to our individual hotel rooms. The third encore parties became a means to an end, not an opportunity for us to hang out together and talk about the gig. Only when the stage lights came on were we a unified rock and roll band. Irving tried to spin the situation, but finally admitted to the Los Angeles Times that the Long Run might have actually marked the end. In February 1980, Heartache Tonight won a Grammy for Best Rock Vocal Performance by a Duo or a Group. Critics reviewed our shows in Los Angeles that March as the finest since the Desperado days. We proved we still had the magic. Our record company, sensing the end was near and panicking, demanded a live album. At the end of July, we booked 5 nights at the 3,000-seat Santa Monica Civic Auditorium to record it. The tickets sold out within hours. We took our places in that little theater each night like automatons, standing in the shadows on the stage, listening to the familiar well of noise from the crowd, before launching into our set and playing the best of our classics. It was a spotless, brilliant, but utterly soulless performance by 5 exhausted, shattered young men. A few days later, on July 31st, Glenn committed us to playing a benefit gig at the Long Beach Arena for the re-election of liberal California Senator Alan Cranston, a night that would forever become known as Long Night at Long Beach. Don and Glenn had been into fundraising for newsworthy political issues for some years, chiefly for the Chumash Indians and for high-profile anti-nuclear and environmental projects. I didn't mind about the apolitical events, but I didn't see the point of benefit gigs for politicians like Cranston or Governor Jerry Brown, most of whom I regard with the greatest suspicion. Jerry was all right. He was dating Linda Ronstadt at the time. He came over to my house, and he was cool. He even helped me find a new site for the Malibu Little League team when their baseball field was being turned into the Malibu Lagoon Bird Sanctuary, and my kids, among others, had nowhere else to play. I called him up, and he sponsored a bill that set aside Malibu Bluffs Park for the Little League players, which was neat. But I was tired, fed up with being told what to do and when, and I didn't even know who the Cranstons were. Later, Cranston was severely reprimanded in the largest saving and loan scandal in U.S. history. I made my views clear, but I knew that if the gods wanted to get into political campaigning, then I wasn't in a position to argue. Still, you never saw John Lennon, Bob Dylan, or Jimi Hendrix getting into bed with a politician. Glenn knew I wasn't comfortable with a rock and roll band doing a show for politicians. His hostility was compounded when Miss Cranston walked up to me backstage to say hello just before we went on stage. "Hello," I replied. "Nice to meet you." As she walked away, I added under my breath, "I guess." Glenn, standing next to me, heard this and viewed my comment as an intentional slap in the face for the Cranstons. But he was wrong. I truly had no idea who they were, nor did I care for that matter. He found me in the dressing room and started yelling at me for what I'd said. I don't know if it was the alcohol, the other drugs, or the fact that we'd been on tour for so long, but he just blew up. As usual, I sat there strumming my guitar and letting him do his thing. Trying to keep the peace, I finally walked out. Just before we stepped on stage for the benefit, I turned to him and said quietly, "You know, Glenn, what you just did back there, you're an hole for doing that." He replied, "That's an honor, coming from you." We walked on stage, and he came over while we were playing The Best of My Love and said, "You, I'm going to kick your butt when we get off the stage." Both of us were burned out after our months on the road. Neither of us really wanted to be there that night, and for me, it was one gig too many. If only we had taken a break after the Santa Monica shows, we could have recharged and rested up. Instead, frazzled and fractious, we focused our unhappiness that night on each other. I started drinking Jack Daniels and was soon drunker than I had been in a while. As the night progressed, we both grew angrier and began hissing at each other under our breaths. In the sound booth, the technicians feared the audience might actually hear our outburst, so they lowered Glenn's microphone until he had to sing. He continued to approach me after every song to rant, rave, curse, and let me know how many songs remained before our fight. "That's 3 more, pal," Glenn said. "Get ready." No sweat. Then we started playing Life in the Fast Lane, and the crowd leaped to its feet. When we came off stage waiting to be called back for the first encore, I kept out of Glenn's way. I knew if I went near him, it would only make things worse. He went over to where the other guys were standing and started shouting something like, "That guy, that Felder." I could hear him on the other side of the stage. I stayed by myself, trying to calm down and finish the gig. Then I remembered something Joe would do to release his tension. Whenever he was pissed off, he'd go somewhere and relieve his frustrations by smashing something. Before returning to the stage for the encores, I told my guitar tech, Jimmy Collins, "Take that Takamine acoustic guitar I play on Lion Eyes and put it by the back door. When I get off stage after the encore, I'm going to break that." When the gig finished, I walked off the side of the stage opposite to the rest of the band again. Most of them took off in their limos, anything to get away from the atmosphere between Glenn and me. I thought I'd be the last to leave the building. I toweled myself off in the dressing room, gathered my senses, and headed out the back door, and the final few cars lined up outside. Seeing the Japanese guitar that Jimmy had put out for me, I took a deep breath, picked it up, held it in my hands for a moment, and then smashed it as hard as I could against the side of a concrete column. My eyes closed. I repeated the exercise again and again, venting all the anger and frustration I felt inside, feeling the strain on the arm I'd broken, falling out of Irene Cooter's Chinaberry tree, and on the shoulder the drunken quarterback dislocated at the Rucker Brothers gig. I thought of Glenn and of Dawn, of the way they sometimes treated me, and of my increasing sense of helplessness and isolation. I thought of my sheer exhaustion of being on the road and away from my family, and what it was doing to my relationship with Susan. I mourned the loss of my fidelity and regretted the numerous sterile sexual encounters that always left me feeling cold and empty. The guitar splintered into a million pieces. By the time I had finished, it was kindling on the floor. Wiping my forehead with the back of my hand, I turned and saw Alan Cranston and his wife standing right behind me, their mouths agape. A few feet away stood a stony-faced Glenn. This had little or nothing to do with the Cranstons, but Glenn thought I did that right in front of them to drive it up his butt. Honest to God, I didn't even see them there. Typical of you to break your cheapest guitar, Glenn told me, cursing when the Cranstons had hurried off to their car in case I started on them. Afraid of what I might do if I opened my mouth to respond, I jumped into my limo and sped off. A few minutes later, Glenn did the same, the two of us locked in mutual enmity. Within a few days, I had completely cooled down. I was in Hawaii, staying in a rented house with Susan and the kids, having a rare week off together. Glenn had offered me his place down there, but after the Cranston benefit, I decided not to take him up on his offer and rented somewhere else. After just 24 hours in Susan's company, the steam had stopped pouring from my ears, and I felt calm again. I promised myself I'd try to stay cool the next time I saw Glenn. The phone rang. It was Bill Seismic. He was in the studio, cleaning up and fixing some of the tracks for the new album, Eagles Live. I assumed he was calling to see what I could come in and fix my parts. "What's the schedule for the band?" I asked. A small silence fell. Bill advised me. "There is no band at this time," he said. His voice echoed hollowly over the line. "What do you mean?" I said. It was 1980, and the Eagles were history. We would never be the same again. Well, that's the end of Chapter 13. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 13 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.